Samuel chapter 4. It's been a minute since I've been up here. Believe it or not, we're working our way slowly but surely through Samuel. I did Daniel before that, and my turn is now in Samuel. We are now sitting in chapter 4. This background that I'm about to give you is probably going to be somewhat familiar, but I think because there's been just enough time gone by that it's worth doing and kind of prudent in framing what's going on historically speaking. So Israel as a nation is going through a transitional time period. It's transitioning from the time of Judges to the time of Kings. And the time of Judges really came about at the end or the death of Joshua. There was, in oversimplified political terms, there was a power vacuum once Joshua died, and it wasn't filled in a traditional sense with another leader or a governing body for Israel. Instead, Israel was to seek God's will and abide by God's will. And they weren't particularly good at doing that during the time of Judges. They had phases that they were pretty good at doing that, and they had phases where they strayed away. In the phases where they strayed away, there would be great conflict, and God would raise up a judge from the people to lead them through that time of conflict and bring them back to himself spiritually as well. And this really happened over the course of 300 plus years. Around 340 years, and we're really at the tail end of this phase now for Israel, the tail end of the phase of Judges, and we're transitioning into the time of Kings. And Samuel is a key figure in that transitional period and really in leading Israel through some of those key transitional points. He goes on to, we saw in last chapter he was a prophet. God uses him as a prophet, and God goes on to even use him to anoint Israel's first king in chapter 8. And in some ways, there's a lot of similarities between chapter 8 and chapter 4, which we're getting ready to study today. There is a general sense from Israel that they really think they know what's best for themselves. They think they have this plan in place, and they're ready to use and put forth this plan because they think it's the best course of action for themselves. And then as sort of an afterthought, they try and squeeze God into it. Instead of consulting him first and seeking his will first, it's an afterthought. And it really turns out to be quite damaging for them on both fronts. Not that there's anything wrong with their initial desires. It's their reasoning for those initial desires that leads them into trouble, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting organization for a government in the form of a king, but their reasoning for wanting a king is this desire to control their own destiny as a nation and not necessarily trust in God, which is what makes it a damaging desire. In chapter 4, we see a desire for them to defend themselves as a nation. And there's nothing inherently wrong with defending yourselves as a nation, especially when you're in the promised land, the land that God has given you. But their reasoning and the actions they took based on that reasoning have some pretty disastrous results, which we'll see here in chapter 4. Samuel, like I said, is a key figure in that transitional time period, but we don't necessarily see him here in chapter 4. We did a study we were introduced to him as a young boy, really, several chapters ago, as he's given over to the temple in service to the Lord. And he's raised as a young man in the temple. And in chapter 3, we see him as a young man speak with God. God gives him a vision, and he in turn gives that vision to Eli. And it's a vision that's really particularly dooming for Eli and his sons, and it's symbolic, or it helps bring to light the level of corruption that has really taken place in the temple and settled in Israel there. So Israel is in definitely a state of spiritual wandering at this point. They don't have strong spiritual leadership at this point. In fact, let's turn back to chapter 3, verse 11. I'm going to read it quickly because it's going to frame sort of the spiritual standing that we have going into chapter 4 here. Chapter 3, verse 11. And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle. And at that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or by offering." So here we have a pretty strong word coming from God, dooming Eli and really his sons. And Eli, at best, at this point, is ambivalent. He is not acting in the way that a high priest should act, and he's installed his sons in positions of power within the temple undeservedly and inappropriately, and they're using that position of power to pursue every carnal desire they can. Basically, they're skimming off the offering. They're having inappropriate relations with women in the temple. I mean, the whole thing is staggering on a level of corruption, and that's what Samuel's growing up in, and that's what's happening to the spiritual leaders of Israel at this point. So there's not a lot of, they aren't grounded in God at this point. And it becomes evident based on the actions that they take here in chapter 4. Moving on, verse 15 of chapter 3, Samuel lay down until the morning, then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. Samuel answered him, Here I am. What was it he said to you? Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide me anything he told you. Hide from me anything he told you. So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then he said, He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes. And it's an interesting juxtaposition. We talked about this last time when we did a study of chapter 3, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But it's hard to read and not point out. It's an interesting juxtaposition that we see here with Eli. Because he goes, what did the Lord tell you? Tell me. He's like eagerly awaiting to hear from the Lord almost, right? And then at the same time, he gets the word from Samuel, and he goes, oh, let it be. It is what it is, right? He seems sort of ambivalent about this whole thing, and we can't know his heart, so we don't want to read into it too much. But it's an interesting juxtaposition, and I can't help but wonder how many times that I'm sitting in my life going, Lord, speak to me. Tell me something. And he's speaking to me, and he's going, why do you not hear? And I'm ambivalent about the response, right? I'm going, oh, I guess, I don't know, right? And so I can't help but wonder how many times that might happen, and it's definitely something that we should be on guard against in our own life, right? There's a whole separate sermon. We talked a lot about that last time, so I'm not going to get into that, but it's definitely worth noting. 19, the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. So Israel is definitely in what would be considered a darker time spiritually. But there is a little bit of hope in that God is using somebody in the temple. God is speaking to somebody in the temple, just maybe not who we might expect. But he's using Samuel already to be a prophet and to spread his word to Eli. And that word is a pretty sobering word, right? And in chapter 4, we actually see a fulfillment of that word in a very, in really, like I said, a very sobering way. Chapter 4, verse 1 is where we're going to start this morning. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. So here we see Here we see Israel getting into a conflict with the Philistines, and the Philistines at this point are their neighbors. Historically speaking, it's generally accepted that the Philistines migrated over from an island called Crete, which had like a Greek background. But there is some debate about that. There is an argument out there that it's possible they migrated from the Mesopotamian and Egypt area. It's agreed that they're from Kaftor. There's just some debate where the land of Kaftor was. But generally speaking, I think most people think it's from Crete. Regardless, they're now Israel's neighbor. They're in southwest. They're southwest of Israel, so basically kind of where Gaza would be. Modern-day Gaza would be, and Israel is fighting with them. We don't know if Israel started the conflict or if the Philistines started the conflict. We're not sure. There's some Jewish writing that seemed to indicate that that the Philistines rather started the conflict, but we don't know. Regardless, they're in it now, and it seems to be some sort of border dispute, right? And for all intents and purposes, they have every right as a nation to defend their border, right? There's no debating that. But like I said before, their methodology for doing so is called into question here, right? So if we look at the next steps, or the next verse rather, verse 3. When the soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant to Shiloh so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So they suffered a great defeat. They got into a fight with the Philistines. The Philistines killed 4,000 men, and it was a military defeat. Now, framed in the scope of their loss that we're going to discuss here in the future, 4,000 men doesn't seem like a lot of men. But on paper, it's easy for us to read. It's easier for us to go through. But 4,000 men is a lot of men. It's a pretty significant defeat, right? So they're feeling disheartened. This is a pretty significant conflict for them, and they're in really a state of despair at this point, right? And they go to ask the right question, but they do it with the wrong heart. We see that in verse 3. When the soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines?" And we really get a glimpse of their heart at this point by their initial response to conflict, right? They respond with confusion, maybe a little bit of fear, maybe a little bit of anger, instead of seeking God, which is what they're supposed to do, right? And this conflict that they have, the defeat of 4,000 men, they ask God, and like I said, it's the right question. It says, "God, why did this happen to us?" Right? If that's an earnest question, that's an appropriate question, especially in a time of conflict, right? But their hearts are not with the Lord. They are straying away from the Lord, and so when this time of conflict is upon them, they're confused. Right? Why is this happening to me? I don't understand what's happening to me. And conflict happens in our life for several reasons. As Christians, as mature Christians, we're sort of led to expect conflict. Right? There's spiritual mountaintops and there's spiritual valleys. And there's many verses and many studies based on around that concept and the way that we should behave in those concepts. Right? And seeking the Lord and drawing closer to the Lord is pretty much always the answer to those spiritual valleys, right? And they are confused by this. They're angry by this. They are afraid of this, but they are not doing the one thing that they're supposed to be doing as believers and as a godly nation, and that's seeking the Lord. So they have a very skewed perspective of conflict in their life. Why is it happening to me? Right? And it's important to understand conflict in our life because it happens for several reasons, right? Number one, we're in a sinful nation. We're in a sinful world. We are in a sinful nation too. But we live in a sinful world. Bad things happen. We're in a fallen world. And number two, sometimes God uses conflict to expose some sin in our life and maybe use it as a tool to remove that sin. Get us to respond with conviction to that sin and get it out of our life. And sometimes it's a tool for God to use just to get us to lean on Him, to draw on Him, to realize that we cannot sustain ourselves and we need to exist in Him. No matter the reason, and just because there's conflict in your life, you shouldn't assume that it's sin. But it is an appropriate question to ask. God, why is this happening to me? Right? Why is this happening to me? Is it sin? Is it something else? Is it just a bad thing? But the answer is the same regardless. Seek God's will and abide in it. It's really simple. It's one of those things that's simple on paper and hard to do in execution. And the risk of not doing that, or the outcome of not doing that and not viewing God in that way and not viewing conflict in that way leads you to have a very skewed perspective of God and who God is. And we see that in the next steps that they take here. Let us bring forth, this is the last part of verse 3, let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. That really seems to escalate quite quickly, right? They go, hey, we lost. It was a pretty major defeat. Let's get the thing that's most holy to us and take it out into the field and wield it like a club, right? And they don't even seek God at any point. They immediately jump to Him and what they would consider their most holy article, right, or their most holy item, and try to figure out how to leverage it to get God to do what they want Him to do, which is to overcome the Philistines. They want to win, right? And they have such a skewed perspective of God that they think this is going to work. And that skewed perspective of God is stemming from, which we'll see here in the next verse, really, really poor spiritual leadership. There's not a lot of accountability right now for them. And so they look at God and they look at God's, he gave them the ark, and they missed the whole point of why he gave it to them. It's a throne for God to sit on in Israel. It's a symbol of God's covenant with Israel. But at the end of the day, not to oversimplify it, but it is just a box, right? And they're missing that. They're almost raising it up to the point where it becomes an idol for them, because their relationship is so skewed with the Lord. And on top of that, it gives us a glimpse of their heart and what they're feeling, what they think they should be getting from this. They look at their relationship with the Lord. They look at their relationship with God, and they think it's unfair that they're in conflict and they lost, right? They go, wait, we did our part. Why didn't you do your part, right? That seems to be the vision or the approach that they're coming to this from. And you look at it and you go, Israel, what part did you do? What are you talking about? You did nothing. But they have such a skewed perspective of who God is that they think it's a transactional-based relationship instead of a grace-based relationship, which we know it to be, right? And so they bring this ark out. They think it's going to win. They think it's going to leverage them. And furthermore, it's even manipulative to the extent where they bring it out, they bring it to the front lines, they bring it into the battle, almost as if to say, like they're daring God. Like, hey, you're not going to lose the ark, are you? No. We're going to take this out here, and surely we can't lose because God's not going to lose the ark. He's not going to let that happen. But they don't seek his will and his guidance at any point in this. And this really is the fault of the spiritual leaders, which we'll see here in the next verse. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. Right? These are their spiritual leaders, Hophni and Phinehas, the Eli's sons. They're supposed to be telling them what to do. They're supposed to be guiding them spiritually. And what do they say? Oh yeah, seems like a good idea. Let's get the ark. Right? And they're out of there. They're going along with it. They are so far away from God at this point because corruption has settled into the temple. Corruption has settled into their lives that they can't even understand how bad of a decision this is. Right? That's where they're at spiritually. And on a side note, and not a side note because it's important, a side note because I'm not going to spend much time here, this is a solid reminder to us to surround ourselves with people that are spiritually grounded, to make sure that our spiritual leaders, our church leaders, our youth group leaders, our home group leaders, anything that you might be in, that they're spiritually grounded, and our peers are spiritually grounded. Because as believers, we know that we're going to face conflict at some point. It's a guarantee. It's not if we face conflict, it's when we face conflict. And when we face conflict, we want to be surrounded with people that are going to help us do the right thing. So that if we respond to a situation like Israel responded to a situation, and we immediately try to problem solve from a human perspective, this is what I want to do, this is what I think I can do, I'm going to go out and do it. As so many of us are quick to do, that people around us, friends, church leaders around us can look and say, hey, have you sought the Lord? Look, I love you. Brother, sister, I love you. But did you seek the Lord in this? And just keep us accountable in our actions and in what we do. They don't have that here, so they're just free to run willy-nilly with their crazy idea that doesn't work. Verse 5, when the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, what's all the shouting in the Hebrew camp? When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. Here's an interesting thing that we see Israel doing, and that I can look back at my life and find myself having done this before. They're confusing a spiritual response with an emotional response, right? They have come up with this plan. They have implemented this plan. They can't feel God's presence in this plan because they didn't seek God. And they are trying to work up an emotional response to this, and they are confusing it with a spiritual response. They're really trying to replace a spiritual response with an emotional response, and it's not going to work. They're in the camp. They're trying to get themselves hyped up, and it's not going to work. And there are many situations where that might happen that we have to be careful about. And it's not that you can't be emotional in your spirituality. You can have spiritual responses that lead to emotional responses. I'm sure, of course it happens. You know, you sit and you think about the love of God long enough, and it's got to bring a tear to your eye. How couldn't it, right? And that's an emotional response. But you don't want to confuse an emotional response with a spiritual response while you're trying to basically force a plan that God didn't have, or that you didn't seek God's will in, right? And I think back in my life where times like this might happen, and hear me out, there's nothing wrong with youth camps, but I think about youth camps a lot when I think about emotional responses versus spiritual responses. And I think a lot of that has to do with my teenage years, right? Because there was sin in my life that I didn't want to let go as a teenager. It was very clear. I was being convicted of this sin. I didn't want to let go of it. I wanted to somehow reconcile my walk with the Lord and maintain the sin in my life. And it wasn't working. And I remember going to youth camps. I remember going to the worship services there, which are loud and, boisterous, and they're trying to cater to the crowd. And I would try and hype myself up into this emotional response, because that's as close to a spiritual connection as I could get, right? And we got to be careful when we're doing that, or we got to be careful really not to do that, right? And so as we're singing, as we're doing things like that, I'm talking a lot about worship services because that's where I've noticed it in my life, but it could happen in many different ways, right? We have to be careful when those things are happening, when we're doing those things, that we're not confusing a spiritual or an emotional response with a spiritual response like they're doing now. And we go on to see Philistines' response to this, and in some ways, it's more appropriate and reverent than Israel's response was, right? Verse 7, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before, right? Number one, they say nothing like this has happened before. They don't look at Israel and see God. They're surprised. What's going on here, right? Number two, they say a god has come into the camp. The Israelites bring the ark into the camp, and they celebrate the ark as an object. The Philistines see that movement, and they recognize it. Now, they say a god, so they're not completely right, but they recognize it as a significant spiritual movement, right? Israel is so far skewed that they're looking at the ark as an object, not as God, and the Philistines can see it as God. Now, again, they're wrong. They see it as a god in their polytheistic culture, not the God, right? Verse 8, woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. So the Philistines even know who this God is, right? They've heard of the things that have happened in Egypt, right? As God was ushering his people to the promised land. They've heard of those things, and they're afraid of those things. And in some ways, Israel's decision to bring the ark to the camp is already working against them. It's created sort of an underdog situation for the Philistines. And the Philistines, by the way, I didn't talk about it earlier, but the Philistines, by the way, are most likely already militarily superior, right? There's a lot of historical evidence pointing to them as the people to bring Greek methodology for forging weapons into that area. They're the first ones to do that. So they have weapons and metal that is superior to them anyway. So they are likely not the inferior military force at this point. Like the military force advantage goes to them because of the weapons that they had, most likely. But they feel now like they're inferior, and they're hyping themselves up. It's created sort of a false underdog situation for them, and they're hyping themselves up. It'd be better to die at this point than to serve the Hebrews. So it's already backfiring for the Israelites. They're bringing in this ark. They thought it would scare the Israelites, and instead it sort of boosts their resolve. It does scare them, but they don't run away in fear. They use that fear to sort of boost their resolve. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 soldiers, 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Now, it's important to understand, like I said, the scope of what just happened here. 30,000 soldiers is a lot of soldiers. My background is a history major, so I oftentimes tend to think of things on historical terms. Most of you that have heard me teach up here before know that. But I oftentimes, for whatever reason, tend to frame things around World War II. I don't know why. It's a point of reference for me, right? And I know a lot about it, and I have studied a lot about it, so I tend to just think of things in the scope of that. And 30,000 soldiers is a significant amount of soldiers to lose in any conflict. I mean, we're talking like major conflicts in World War II. Operation Overlord was a main conflict in World War II, and that's when the Allies took back or started to take back the European continent. Major battles happened under Operation Overlord, one of the biggest ones being D-Day, right, that everybody knows. And the scope of American casualties, or deaths, I should say, on that front is about the same. It's not exactly the same, but that's about the scale that you're looking at here in regard. And that Operation Overlord was conflicts that spanned 2 months. So we're talking pretty long conflict here, and Israel lost that many in one battle. So it was a great defeat for them. You know, this is a significant, and we know it is a punishment from God based on the spiritual circumstances that they're in, and it's a fulfillment of the prophecy that he's given Eli. So we know God is doing this to them because of things that are happening on the home front. So it's a significant punishment for Israel at this point. And it's obviously quite disheartening. Verse 12, that same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching because his heart feared for the ark of the Lord. When the man entered the town and he told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, what is the meaning of this uproar? That's about a 20-mile run. So somebody did that in one day, obviously as urgently as possible. There's a Jewish tradition that you may have heard of where they think it was Saul that did this, but there's really no biblical evidence to support that. But it is an interesting Jewish tradition. And Eli, so this runner goes to Eli. The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old, whose eyes were set so that he could not see. He told Eli, I have just come from the battle lines. I have fled from it this very day. Eli asked, what happened, my son? Verse 17, the man who brought the news replied, Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led Israel 48 years. So notice his response to this news, right? And I really, in some ways, not on the scale that he's on, thankfully, but in some ways I can empathize with Eli, right? And I really do feel sorry for Eli in this situation because he's sitting and he's waiting to hear back, and he's waiting to hear back news of the ark. He knows what he allowed to happen because he did allow this to happen through his ambivalence. He knows what he allowed to happen was wrong, right? I shouldn't have done that. Whoops. You know, you're looking at this play out and you're going, this is going to be bad, right? And you can't help but empathize with him in the sense that he's just sitting there, realizing that he sinned and waiting for the consequences to land. It's not a fun spot to be in. And I don't envy him at all in this spot. And he hears of the news of the loss of the military battle, and he takes it. He hears of the loss of his sons, and he takes that loss. And then he hears of the loss of the ark, which we know he was truly concerned about. And that essentially killed him, right? He fell over. The shock of it, the grief of it, whatever it is, he fell over and broke his neck. And that is really the fulfillment of the prophecy that we saw God talking about in chapter 3, when he said Hophni and Phinehas, his 2 sons, would die on the same day. Eli saw the fulfillment of that prophecy, and then he too died that day. So very sobering thing, very sobering moment right now for Israel. 19. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. And as she was dying, the woman attending her said, "Don't despair, you have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. Giving birth to a son ordinarily, under any circumstances, would be a moment to celebrate, especially now in this culture. A birth of a son was a continuation of the lineage. It's a significant thing. And she's overcome with grief. She doesn't even, and she's dying. She doesn't want to acknowledge that even. Verse 21, she named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel." What a sobering name. Because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband, she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." She's responding to the events that have taken place in Israel, over the course of days of conflict, right? And she's responding to this and saying the glory has departed. And she's true. She's correct in saying that the glory has departed and the ark has departed, because the ark is captured. But what she's maybe not realized is that the glory really in some ways had departed Israel a long while ago with the level of corruption that had taken place. And we see that in the actions that they take now that led to the capturing of the Ark of the Covenant. So she's capturing and she's responding to that initial moment, but it's really a spiritual state. It's symbolic of the spiritual state that Israel has been in for a while. And it is a sobering moment, right? For Israel, it is a sobering reminder that their plans, that their nation exist under God's grace, much like our own lives exist under God's grace and God's control. And when we try to take control for ourselves, when we try to exert our own power and our own authority, we oftentimes have sobering reminders that it doesn't work. And the important thing to remember here, too, is that Israel lost the Ark of the Covenant. God didn't lose the Ark of the Covenant, right? And he's going to go on and use it in pretty significant ways in chapter 6 and 7, and ultimately bring it back to Israel in a pretty amazing way. And it's a reminder to us that it can be a sobering reminder and it can be an encouraging reminder. God doesn't need us to be glorified, right? We are here as believers. We glorify God. That's what we do. But if we step out and we act in our own ways, His will is going to be done regardless. That's encouraging in some sense, knowing that as sinful, fallen humans, we can't really screw up His plans too much, right? So that is encouraging. But on the flip side, one of the greatest joys of being a believer is living in God's will and seeing His plan play out before us and being a part of that. That's an amazing place to be as a believer. And when you go out and you forge your own path and then try and fit God into it, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, I want to be careful how I say this, because there are times where you might be seeking God's plan and you don't quite know it fully. And you might be called to step out in faith and not fully understand what's happening. That's not the same as forging your own plan and fitting God into it. Many of you know the story of how I ended up in Nashville, but for those of you that don't, I'll share it with you. To me, that's a big moment in my life that I'll always probably call back to, where God was calling me, and thankfully, God worked in my heart and I responded to it. But I wasn't sure how it was going to play out. But what happened is I grew up in Washington State, West Coast, until late high school. I moved to Virginia. I met my wife there in Virginia. We got married and we settled down. I lived in Virginia for about 5 years. My wife was born and raised in Virginia. I really had no indication that I would be leaving Virginia, except for maybe the possibility that I might be moving back to the West Coast, Washington State, where most of the rest of my family was staying. About 5 years after living in Virginia, We were living in the basement of my in-laws. They rented us out the basement. And we were trying to figure out what to do. And I started praying and doing my quiet time. And I went to Tara and I said, it's weird, but I feel like we're supposed to do something, but I don't know what. I feel like God's calling us to do something. And she said, yeah, I kind of get that feeling too. And so we determined to pray about it and see what happened. And we prayed about it. And this was over the course of like 6 months. It was just kind of like we were in flux. We were uneasy. We weren't sure what was happening. But we were trying to respond to it in a way that would glorify God, right? And finally, we talked and we said, I think he's asking us to leave Virginia. I don't know where, but I think he's asking us to leave Virginia. We prayed about it some more, and we came to understand that was to be. But I had no indication of where to go, right? And I was so reserved about forcing God's hand that I was like in this stalemate, where I didn't want to force his hand. I didn't want to, and I was scared, to be honest, right? And I didn't want to like step out presumptuously. But Tara and I talked about it. We prayed about it. And we determined that we were going to buy some tickets to Denver. We had no reason to pick Denver. The reason I wanted to pick Denver was because it has good skiing there. So it was a very selfish reason, in all honesty. But I was like, I don't know what else to do. I feel like we're getting called. Maybe we just need to get out and then see what happens. So I bought a ticket to Denver after debating and sort of deliberating for months about this thing. Days after I bought the ticket to Denver, I don't remember exactly how many, 1, 2, 3 days after I bought the ticket to Denver, I had my buddy call me. He was the best man in my wedding, best friend from high school. He called me, and he goes, hey, how do you feel about Nashville? And I said, where is this coming from? What are you talking about? I hadn't talked to him. I hadn't told anybody we were really considering about moving. And he goes, well, I have this job down here, and I thought maybe you might be interested. So I moved my ticket from Denver. I canceled the ticket to Denver. I moved it to Nashville. I said, well, why not? Go out and give it a shot, interview, see what happens. I went to the interview, and 2 weeks after the interview, I had packed up my car and drove to Nashville. And here we are, nine years later, 4 kids later, pretty settled. And the whole thing, I look back at that whole thing, and in some ways, I still feel like I'm waiting to see what else God has planned. Because I'm like, okay, he brought me to Nashville, now what? Right? And Tara and I kind of joke about it. It's like, we got here, now what? And in some ways, we feel like he's not done. There's still something left, but we don't know what it is, right? And sometimes it takes time. Sometimes you have to keep seeking. What I'm saying is meant to be encouraging in that sometimes when you're seeking God's will, you don't know the outcome. And out of a fear of forcing his hand, I think some people can sit and do nothing. And I'm not going to be the one to sit up here and tell you to act. Only God knows your heart. Only you and God are communicating. But what I am saying is that sometimes he starts a plan and a path for us that we don't know the outcome to. And sometimes we have to step out a little bit in faith and see what happens. Now, we do want to make sure that we're seeking him and abiding by his will so that we don't force his hand. A classic example of forcing his hand or putting God in a box, if you will, is the story of Abraham and Sarah, right? They're promised a child. They think they know what's best for them. They think God forgot about them. They think God forgot about that promise, and they went ahead and said, hey, let's do this our own way. Let's step out and do it our own way. And the results of that are still felt today in conflicts around the world, right? I mean, it can be disastrous to view God in this way, to view him as a lucky charm. So we got to be careful as a church, as as individuals, as believers, that we don't do that. But instead that we seek him and we abide by him. And in those moments of conflict, when they come, as we see here in Israel, it becomes a much more fulfilling experience. Not to say that conflict is a good thing and there's a lot of pleasure from the conflict in our lives, but it becomes a lot more fulfilling spiritually. When we understand that conflict is to draw us closer to God, instead of just sort of to mess with us, or God isn't holding up his end of the bargain, then it becomes a lot easier to endure, right? And in some ways, you're blessed through enduring it by drawing closer to God. There's an interesting thing that happens when we stray away from God and we view conflict, and we see it here with Israel, in that it becomes a transactional-based system. They look at God, they see the whole thing as unfair, and they go, why did you let this happen to me? And we look at that and we go like, well, surely I would never do that, right? I wouldn't do that. I know that this is a grace-based relationship, but I would argue that it happens on an individual level more than we're comfortable admitting. For example, a classic one for myself is I'll be going day to day, and, bad things happen, right? Something bad happens at work, trouble with money, big bills come up, you name it. There's any sort of mini conflicts that happen throughout the day. And my response in my heart, sometimes, I'm ashamed to admit, is, God, I did my quiet time this morning. Why did this happen to me? I'm communicating with you. Why is this happening to me? And it's so easy to view our relationship with God as a transactional basis. Like there's something we did, so now he has to hold his end of the bargain up. And that's not how it works at all. God, I tithed this month. Why am I having financial troubles? You said I'd be blessed, right? And you look at it and you go, no, that's not how this works. We didn't earn any of this. We don't deserve any of this. Our relationship with God through Jesus is based on grace and mercy, and that's it. And as soon as we can realize that and behave in that way, the moments of conflict become much more fulfilling. When you look at conflict, all of a sudden you realize, yeah, I probably deserve this. Or I live in a sinful world. This is what's going on. Let me seek God and see what he's trying to teach me. Let me seek God and see if I just need to lean on him and have him sustain me through this. And conflict becomes much more bearable. The last thing we want to do is force God's hand. We see the disastrous results here. So let's remember that as we go out today. I'm going to pray and close this out, and I think we have one more song here. Lord, thank you for this time that we were able to spend in your word. Thank you for this time that we were able to study your word. And as we look at the nation of Israel, we're in some ways quick to judge. In some ways, we're possibly even saying, I wouldn't do things like that. Yet in some other ways, it's so eerily similar. Lord, and I pray that you, if there's anybody going through that moment of conflict, going through that spiritual valley, that they reach out and seek you and seek your face and find you as the ultimate sustaining source, Lord. That they don't try and do it on their own. That they can reach out and abide in you and abide in your will and see the joy in that, Lord. And I pray that you would encourage people in that conflict now to do that. And I pray that you watch over those people on those spiritual mountaintops that are not in conflict, that they would remember this when they get into conflict. It's not a transactional-based relationship. We didn't do anything to deserve this. Nothing at all, Lord. We get to seek your face and see your presence and eventually sit in your presence all through your grace and mercy and the death of Jesus, Lord. And we're thankful for that eternally. And I pray that we never forget that. In your name, amen.